just the most extraordinary outcome for Scott Morrison today.
Coalition 41.5, Labor 33.3, an 8% gap on first preferences, not the 1 or 2% that was reported in an opinion poll.
Virtually no one thought Scott Morrison would win.
I have always believed in miracles.
Well, it seems everybody accepts it was a miracle, which means nobody saw it coming.
We obviously have to regroup. We didn't expect to be where we are.
And that's because Labor, along with most people, had their expectations set in large part by the polling.
It is the very best predictor of what we will see tonight, and here is our projection. The Labor Party to win. Our exit poll is predicting Bill Shorten will be Prime Minister for the next 3 years.
An academic inquiry into the performance of the polls later declared it was not just a miss, but a polling fail. And it was a fail of a size not seen in decades, coming after a long period of poll accuracy.
It was almost like everyone had been seduced into the fact that polls were these soothsayers of the future, and it never was. It was just, in a way, a golden decade where the polls just landed where the results did. So, what went wrong, and how confident can we be about polling in 2022? The most accurate poll would be one that surveys every single voter. We do that every 3 years on election day, but it costs the taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. So instead, pollsters draw their conclusions from smaller samples. These days, most have online panels they get respondents from. Some still call people on the phone. The cheapest polls are robocalls. None of these methods are perfect though, and many of the problems from last election come back to the way the samples are generated. Last time around, there were 5 national polls being regularly published. Here's how far each of them was out from the election result in their final polls held before the 2019 election. All of them underestimated the coalition's primary vote on average by 2.8 percentage points. All but one of them overestimated Labor's first preference vote by a similar amount. And here's what the poll said about the two-party preferred vote. Again, they were out by 2.9 percentage points. And those errors matter because they have a real-world impact. For better or worse, the polls themselves affect the way stories are covered, how parties campaign, even how political parties choose their leaders.
The one thing that is clear about our current situation is the trajectory. We have lost 30 news polls in a row. It is clear that the people have made up their mind about Mr Abbott's leadership.
We'd made polling a default scoreboard for politics, which it never was intended to be. It was never meant to be predictive, it was always indicative.
When you see a national poll with its estimate of the support for each of the major parties, it's just that, an estimate. Credible pollsters will publish a margin of error, giving you a range of numbers that could reasonably be the true support for each party. It varies from poll to poll, but typically you're looking at a margin of between 2 and 3 percentage points either side of the published number. So, if you see a poll that suggests it's a 50-50 race, well, that really means we're talking about both parties sitting somewhere in a range of possibilities from 47 to 53. The true number is more likely to be 50 than 47, but you can't rule out anything in that range. And that's a pretty wide window. In fact, it's wide enough to encompass most Australian election results. Go back through 40 years of Australian electoral history, and the only results that don't fall within this window are Tony Abbott's 2013 win, John Howard's first win in '96, and Bob Hawke's landslide win in 1983.
To expect the polls to be used or be able to support a precise prediction of who's going to win the election is really a step too far.
Good evening, my name is Sharon and I'm calling from Melbourne.
There's a second problem with the margin of error, that 2 or 3% window either side. It assumes that the people you're polling are a truly randomly chosen group of voters. And getting a group like that is a very difficult and very expensive task.
When we talk about random samples and probability samples, we're talking about a golden era from the 50s or 60s that just doesn't exist anymore. When we're looking at opinion polls now, you know, that's maybe 5% of the people who we contact actually give us an answer about how they're going to vote.
So the margins of error currently reported give a sense of false precision to the polls.
The difficulty with finding a truly random group of voters is the source of the other big problem with the 2019 polls. Let's look back at all the polls published between the 2016 election and the 2019 election. Every red dot here is one poll's estimate of Labor's first preference vote. For the most part, the polls had Labor above 36%. Now, let's bring in an analysis from some University of Sydney political scientists. This shaded area, that's their estimate of Labor's actual support through those 3 years. And on their estimate at least, support for Labor rarely, if ever, cracked 36% for that entire 3-year period. We couldn't know that at the time. We only know it in hindsight now after seeing the 2019 result. That consistent overestimate, it's a hint something was wrong with the poll's design. One of the theories is that there were too many of some groups in the pollsters' samples, and that wasn't being corrected.
The samples that the pollsters rely on tended to overrepresent people with educational bachelor's degree and higher, were more likely to participate in the polls, as were people that were more interested in politics.
That's actually the same problem that had been found in the United States after the 2016 presidential election 3 years earlier. Most Australian pollsters are now looking at education level when they construct their polls and making adjustments so the makeup of the polling panel looks like the reality of Australia. They're doing what they can to correct for an imperfect sample.
Swinging voters are the most interesting, you know, people in our political system. They don't think like people who are rusted-on voters, but also they're much less likely to answer the call when a pollster rings.
The other changes some pollsters have made is how they publish the all-important two-party preferred numbers. Resolve, a new pollster on the scene this electoral cycle, isn't publishing an estimate at all, while Essential has decided the traditional method of excluding undecided voters was a mistake.
We've got between 8 and 12% of people that just don't know where they're going. For the state of elegance, polling had taken those out of the sample so we could give you a nice 52-48, when the reality was, even in the lead up to election, it was about 49-47 with 6% undecided.
They're the big changes we know about, but all pollsters in Australia keep the detail of their methods secret.
So we've done a few other little tweaks behind the scenes, but I wouldn't have a business if I was sharing all of that.
And for the pollsters to say, which some of them do, they have a secret sauce in their weighting ingredient and things like that, it actually does them a disservice. It sounds like a thumb on the scale.
There is some more transparency with the formation of the Australian Polling Council last year, modelled on similar groups overseas. That requires members to publish a standard set of information about how the poll was conducted. It's not a detailed list, but it's a lot more detailed than we've ever seen before. But not all the pollsters are members. Essential are, YouGov Galaxy, who produce Newspoll, are, but we know less about Resolve, which does polling for the 9 newspapers, and Roy Morgan, which publishes its own polls.
It's important that people have faith in how well they're conducted, and the way to establish that faith is through having a high level of transparency. I believe, and the inquiry believed, that obligation rests with the pollsters to be very transparent.
So the big question is, can we trust the polls in 2022?
I think we have to get more used to polling misses. We have to probably recalibrate the way that we think about polling misses.
I'd much rather be sort of building insights on this as opposed to the betting markets or a social media read. But yeah, there is no certainty.
And the only benchmark we'll have to measure the accuracy of this round of polls,
the only poll that matters, the only poll that counts.
That the only poll that counts.
The only poll that matters.
I brought the manual with me, I'll see what it says. It says I should say polls come and go, but the only poll that matters is on election day.